Hello and welcome to the stream. How's it going? I'm Tandy. Today we're going to be doing a little set review for Phyrexia will be one. I couldn't remember the name of the set for a second. We'll be going over the set for Pioneer specifically, talking about how it's going to impact Pioneer. We'll go over all the rares and mythics and some of the uncommons. I'll do like a quick scroll through. Before we get started today, just want to say thanks for hanging out. Thanks for being here. We stream most weekdays. Wednesday, I write my article for my Patreon. My most recent article is my new Phyrexia will be one top 10. And I build 9 decks with those 10 cards because one deck contains both cards. Let's go ahead and get started, shall we? All right, first up. Elesh, Norn, Mother of Machines, 4 and a white for a legendary Phyrexian Obliterator. 4/7 Vigilance. If a permanent entering the battlefield causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, it triggers a second time, or an additional time. Permanents entering the battlefield don't cause abilities of permanents your opponents control to trigger, so it's both suppressive and doubling. So this is very similar to like a Panharmonicon on a creature. Things like Reflector Mage and Siege Rhino are going to have huge upticks in value when this is on the table. You can cast this a number of ways. One of the easiest ways is going to be just like playing Llanowar Elves and ramping into it for like turn 3. But you can also play Elesh, Norn, Mother Machines alongside, like Oath of Nissa, right? Like Oath of Nissa allows you to play those elves, lets you curve into Elesh, Norn nicely because it says if a permanent triggers. So that means like you can play Elesh, Norn in like a Bant deck or green-white or Naya. But the trick is just finding the right creatures that say enters the battlefield or the right permanents that say enter the battlefield. One of my recent builds was Abzan with Siege Rhino, Skyclave, Apparition. Another build I've done is Enigmatic Incarnation. As a one-off for Enigmatic, I think it's excellent because almost all the enchantments from that deck and the creatures all have enters the battlefield effects, and you can tutor up Elesh Norn pretty easily off of sacking Fires of Invention. So definitely interested in Elesh Norn. I think it's going to be a game changer for Pioneer for a couple different decks, and a couple people will build decks around it. It is expensive. It will probably see the most play in Commander. I love this card. I think it's a cool design. It's very powerful for constructed. Interested to see how people take it. Next up, Jace, the Perfected Mind. 2 blue and a Phyrexian blue, so you can play him for 4, or you can play him for 3. It's completed, so if you pay the Phyrexian, he loses 2 loyalty. +1 until your next turn. Up to 1 target creature gets -3/-0. -2, target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3. Otherwise, you only draw 1. And then -X, target player mills 3 times X cards. So this card's pretty scary, I think. Like, you play for 4 mana, you tick up, shrink a creature. You untap, you mill for 18. You can play it for 4, you can immediately mill 15. You can play for 3 and mill 9, or you can start drawing cards. There's a lot of different cool play patterns to Jace, and I think that the big takeaway is that it's a 3-mana Planeswalker. 3-mana Planeswalkers are pretty rare. Usually when you see them, they're pretty powerful. We'll be talking about another 3-mana Planeswalker later. This one, I don't think it's going to see that much play in Pioneer, but it could spawn its own archetype. I don't know exactly what type of deck other than a mill deck will want this, but some sort of self-mill deck might love this, right? Think like your Hedron Crab style deck, your Stitcher Suppliers and things like that. Like those decks, like if a deck would want Vengevine, maybe it wants Jace Perfected Mind, right? Maybe. But I think this is going to be more for modern. You're going to see this maybe as a sideboard option for the 8 crab decks. 8 crab decks can turn this on pretty nicely. They already play Visions of Beyond, but this is Visions of Beyond that also can just be a win condition, so. Yeah, exactly, Ryan. Losing a couple loyalty on this one's not a big deal. It actually has a ton of loyalty to start, so. For only 3 mana, it comes in with 3 loyalty, ticks up to 4, shrinks a thing. I think that's pretty good. Again, I don't think this is going to see a ton of Pioneer play, but it's certainly cool, and I think a lot of people will love it. Next up, Vraska Betrayal Sting. This Planeswalker costs 6 mana or a Phyrexian in 5. Starts with 6 loyalty. 0, you draw a card and lose 1 life and then proliferate. So instead of having a plus, it's a 0 that proliferates. So you can utilize that along with your other Planeswalkers, things that get +1/+1 counters, poison, etc. I don't like that you lose a life. I think that you're going to find a decent amount of scenarios where you're low enough on life where you'll never do the 0 again. We saw this kind of happen a decent amount with other planeswalkers that have similar effects, where if you draw a card, you end up losing some amount of life, and it ends up being a lot worse for you over the next couple turns against like aggro decks because you just lose too much. With that said, the minus ability is pretty good, right? If you only play it for 5 mana, the minus ability costing 2 means it's going to stick around with 2 loyalty left. So target creature becomes a treasure artifact with tap, sack this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and loses all other card types and abilities. So you don't gain the treasure. So you basically just get to turn your opponent's thing into a treasure. So your opponent gets the extra mana. So it's kind of like a Swords to Plowshares, but you can do it twice. You can 5 mana minus, and then next turn, if you get to untap, you get to minus again. So there's some benefit for your opponent, but I think it's worth considering how cost effective it is for you. -9. If target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get a number of poison counters equal to the difference. Okay, so not quite killing, but you can -9 and then 0 in the next turn, or -9 and then play a new one and 0 and proliferate and kill them. So the ultimate doesn't seem like it's that hard to get to. Tick up 3 times, drawing 3 cards. Obviously, on a dry board is very easy, but on a gummed up board, it doesn't protect itself that well. Like, minusing on a creature is great, right? You can kill things, but that shrinks the loyalty down to 2. So if your opponent has 2 creatures in play, it's very likely Vraska is going to die when you minus. But I don't know. I think there's a lot of things you can do with this card. I haven't felt particularly incentivized to brew around it. I think that the card, to me, lacks identity. If you look back at the history, let's see, what is it? Obnixilis Reignited. I think Obnixilis Reignited is the easiest one to compare it to, right? This is an older card from I want to say Battle for Zendikar era. But 5 mana, 5 loyalty, +1, you draw a card and lose a life. See, makes some sense. -3, destroy a creature. See, makes some sense. -8, you get a loyalty or ability that's basically win the game. I think that Black Planeswalkers look a lot like Obnixilis Reignited in the last couple years in a bad way. Like they need a lot more of their own identity, and I think Proliferate can help towards that, but it just plays a little too similarly to that Obnixilis for my taste. So I'm not super in love with this one. Any shelf horror? So Disco Bear, if you want to play Vraska Betrayal Sting, I would recommend doing it in just like maybe like black white planeswalkers or something. You know, I would like this in a Super Friends deck, but it doesn't have to be Jeskai. It can be you know, like if you do black white, you get the Wandering Emperor and you get the Eternal Wanderer. And then there's probably some other planeswalkers you can play too that are in Pioneer. My take on this one is that you want to play it with other planeswalkers. It doesn't seem like you want to play this in a creature deck that has +1/+1 counters. Doesn't seem like it really fits. But maybe with the proliferate, just putting that to use is good. Yeah, she is very splashable. 4 and a black essentially is all you need to play her. So you could play this in an elf deck as well. Could maybe Vraska along Emergent Ultimatum and Vorinclex. I don't think so. I guess they could go up to 9 poison counters immediately, but you don't get to use the ability again. You know, not that turn anyway. I like Emergent Ultimatum to be, if you don't do anything about this card on the stack, you're dead. Lotus Field does a great job of that. I don't know of any other decks who do that consistently. So also people can kill Vorinclex with Vraska still on the stack. So I just don't think that combination is a winning line these days. All right, next up, Capricious Hellraiser. 3 and 3 red for a 4/4 flyer, Phyrexian Dragon. The spell costs 3 less to cast if you have 9 or more cards in your graveyard. When Capricious Hellraiser enters the battlefield, exile 3 cards at random from your graveyard. Choose a non-creature, non-land card from among them, and copy it. You may cast the copy without paying its mana cost. So for 6 mana, you exile 3 cards from your graveyard at random, and then you can play a non-creature, non-land card for free. So if you play Capricious Hellrider in like the top end of just like a red blue deck. Let's say you're a red blue deck. You can play a removal spell, you can play a treasure cruise, you can play whatever. Now, it is a little hard to get 9 cards into your graveyard, but it's not that hard. It's not that hard. I don't know exactly where this one's gonna fit because it does have a little bit of bad synergies with treasure cruise and other delve spells. You want to keep your graveyard nice and heavy. I would say that this is probably just going to be the top end of a big red deck. I don't think that big red deck is going to be very good, or at least not for a while. This reminds me a lot of like a Bedlam Reveler, but it's a Bedlam Reveler that like gains tempo instead of gains cards. But it also doesn't incentivize you to empty your hand. You don't have to empty your hand like Bedlam Reveler, so you could play this in a blue deck. You don't have to play it in a black deck. You know, I always thought that the Rakdos decks that played a bunch of, Faithless Lootings and stuff in Modern, those are really good at enabling Bedlam Reveler. We don't have, Burning Inquiry and things like that, but if you want to try this thing in Modern, I think this thing could be great in Modern. I know Aspiring Spike's been talking about it a bunch. I think he'll probably end up playing it. I mean, this reminds me, like, you can play this with, like, Seething Song type stuff, I know Seething Song's banned in Modern, but, like, that's the kind of cards that I want alongside Capricious Hellraiser. I want, Manamorphose and all those types things. Maybe this is, like, either a 1 or 2 of in the top end of, like, the Prowess deck, because you do play a bunch of, like, Manamorphoses and you fill your graveyard with, old, Darcy, random kills it for you. Yeah, it's a little tough on the random, but it's red, red, red for a 4/4 flyer that plays a free spell. Like, you can't just make it Snapcaster Mage or whatever. That'd be kind of wild. I don't know. I think this card's awesome. I have no idea how to build around it yet. I might just like challenge myself to build a bunch of decks around it in Pioneer just to see. We'll see though. It's a mythic rare. It's a cool ability. It's a cool card. Even for 6 mana, it's a cool card. Hell, you could go end of turn, dig through time, untap, cast this for 6, and play Magnum Opus out of your graveyard. You could actually control this if you want to. If you don't have the 9 clause, the 9 card clause, you can control this really easily with stuff. You just have to pay 6 mana for it. But then it's just Torrential Gearhulk at sorcery speed. So I don't know how much worth it is to play that over this. All right, next up. Nissa Ascended Animist. 7 mana. 7 loyalty, 2 of its Phyrexian with completed. +1, create an XX Phyrexian Hoarder, where X is Nissa's loyalty. -1, destroy target artifact or enchantment. -7, until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each force you control and gain trample. I built a deck around this with this card in it recently, and I want to show it to you and talk about it. Give me a moment. All right, so this is the deck that has the Nissa in it, and we can play more copies of Nissa, but I want to talk about it a little bit. So this is Mono Green Devotion, but aggressive. Instead of doing the Storm of the Festivals and stuff, we are playing a bunch of creatures that allow us to get aggressive and use Nissa Voices Vindicator and Vivian Arcbow Ranger in very aggressive ways. But what this does is it gives us incentive to not play Storm the Festival, which actually opens up Nissa Ascendant Animist to being playable. I think that if you're playing a deck with a Storm Festival, you cannot play Nissa Ascended Animist. But if you want to be more aggressive, I think it's great for a more aggressive style mono green. In this build, we're utilizing Burning Tree Emissary, Werewolf Pack Leader as early 2-drops to facilitate that aggressive start. And then we're finishing it with Bloated Contaminator. Bloated Contaminator is a 3 mana 4/4 trample, toxic 1. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. So you play Bloated Contaminator. The following turn, you give it a +1/+1 counter, or you give it trample, or both. And then you attack, and you put a counter on everything, or Ranger class, or whatever, right? Anything that already has a counter on it. And that's kind of the gist of the deck. Nissa Ascended Animist is just a top-end Planeswalker that kind of fits into the shell. If you wanted to, like, trim a Ranger class for a second Nissa in this build, I think that you could easily do that. Can you explain Bloated Contaminator over Old Ghost Troll? So this is a Tokens Matter deck, right? Bloated Contaminator has Proliferate on it. If you can give it trample, if it already has trample, if you can give it a counter, it's going to double that counter. If it's going to double the counter on Ranger class, it's going to zoom up Ranger class quickly. It's going to zoom up Vivian or Nissa quickly. The minus on this puts counters on everything. It's going to zoom those up quickly. It's very similar to like Winding Constrictor, except it's huge. It's large, so you can play it in a mono green deck. So we're using it with Llanowar Elves to play it on turn 2. If you play Old Growth Troll instead, you'll have draws where you can't play Old Growth Troll on turn 2 because of Nykthos. And the way that the other version of the deck gets around that is that they have Oath of Nissa and they have Wolfwillow Haven. So they have stuff to do on turn 2 that's not play Old Growth Troll. We aren't really built like that. So we have to lean into something else. And we're leaning way more aggressive. And we're leaning on the proliferate mechanic. And I think that it's important to at least try it, right? To build around it. In this build, you could easily trim a Voracious Hydra. You could easily trim a Ranger class. Those 2 cards could be whatever you want. You could even play 2 Voracious Hydra and cut 1 more card like a Vivian or a land and play 4 Growth Troll. This is just a preliminary build around Bloated Contaminator, but it has Nissa in it. And I want to showcase a list that could play the Nissa. Speaking of Nissa specifically, we talked about the deck a bit, but this is a card that has a lot of uses, right? There's tons of artifacts and enchantments in Pioneer. The minus ability is going to be good in a number of situations and matchups. Making a creature is excellent, but the real money on this card is playing it for 7. If you ever have 7 mana and this card in your hand, it's overrun. It's overrun like crazy. And with just a couple Llanowar Elves, you can kill opponents from high life totals, right? Now, it is forest only. It's not each land. So we do have to play a bunch of forest. That's why we're not playing... we're playing 1 Boseiji and 2 layers, but we're not playing a bunch of other things, right? We have a ton of forests, 16, but maybe we should be more. I don't know. Next up, we have Phyrexian Vindicator. It's 4 white mana for a 5/5 flyer. If damage would be dealt to Phyrexian Vindicator, prevent that damage. When damage is prevented this way, Phyrexian Vindicator deals that much damage to any other target. So Phyrexian Vindicator is a callback to Phyrexian Obliterator. The Vindicator, instead of punishing your opponent immensely for dealing damage, your opponent just can't deal damage to it. It's essentially the same thing. No one ever deals damage to Obliterator without losing the game. So I think what you're going to see here with Vindicator is it's going to be the top end threat and like a more aggressive white deck. Now, whatever white deck wants to play this, I don't know. I think you want to lean maybe more mid-rangey and you just play maybe like lay down arms and things like that. You can play Ossification. You can play Planeswalkers like the Wandering Emperor and Eternal Wanderer. I don't really know how best to abuse the ability. And I think that when you play with new cards, it's okay at the start if you're playing it just to see if it's good. And in this situation, I think we all know that it's good. Like, it's a good card. And now the question is, how do we turn it into Boros Reckoner good? Because when Boros Reckoner was in Standard, we not only played it in Blasphemous Act decks, where we would deal 13 to it and kill the opponent, but we also played it alongside Harvest Pyre, 2 mana, exile any number of cards from your graveyard, and then deal that much damage to any target creature. And so Phyrexian Vindicator might need some more stuff like that to really make it juicy. But its stats are excellent, right? 4 mana, 5/5 flyer. Your opponent can't deal damage to it, period. If they try to deal damage to it, they're fucked. This card's pretty insane. I don't really know what else to say about it. Yeah, you can play this with Deafening Clarion. This seems kind of cool. Anything that deals damage to all creatures, this card's great alongside, and Deafening Clarion's definitely a sweet one. Yes, this card does love Star of Extinction. If you can pull that off, you get bonus points. You can fetch this and Star of Extinction. Now, that's a cool combo. I don't like playing cards in Emergent Ultimatum decks, though, that aren't really castable if you draw them. I feel like it's very hard to put cards back in your deck in this format, so. Icarmoon Gauntlet. So this is one that I don't think is for me, but that's okay. So 3 mana artifact. Planeswalkers you control have 0 proliferate and -12. Take an extra turn after this one. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose a counter on target permanent, put an additional counter of that kind on that permanent. This is nonsense. This is a nonsense card for nonsense people doing nonsense things. By all means, have a blast. Play this and other Time Walk cards, I guess. I don't know. Next up, Phyrexian Obliterator. A reprint. Black. for a 5/5 trample, whenever a source deals damage to Phyrexian Obliterator, that source's controller sacrifices that many permanents. Okay, so this is not one you want to play alongside Deafening Clarion or Anger of the Gods or whatever. Phyrexian Obliterator wants to go at the top end of a mono black aggressive deck, or at the top of a mono black mid-range deck with a twist. I think this card is great alongside things like Primal Might or Bushwhack if you want to play some fighting stuff. The trick is always, as always, is going to be the mana base. But I think a light green splash in like a mono black mid-range deck is okay. You could play Abrupt Decay, you could play Grizzly Salvage, you could play Assassin's Trophy, Vraskas of various types. And then you could just have Bushwhack in your deck, right? Go get a Swamp. Or, guess what? Fight You! Seems pretty good. This reprint is, like, pretty scary. When it was first around, the only thing really holding it back was that Mono Black just wasn't very good in that set. In that standard format. But Phyrexian Obliterator has been a house in, like, Extended before, right? Extended was around for a little while with Obliterator before it switched over to Modern, I think. And we were doing stuff with Obliterator in that format for a little while because we had Fetch Shock Overgrown Tomb was really cool. But yeah, card's cool. Next up, all will be one. They said the thing. They said the thing, chat. They said the thing. 3 red enchantment. Whenever you put one or more counters on a permanent or player, all will be one deals that much damage to target opponent, creature, or an opponent controls, or planeswalker and opponent controls. So basically, every time you proliferate, you get to do 1/1/1/1/1/1. Every time you play a planeswalker with a bunch of loyalty, you do that much damage to something. This is a really cool enchantment with a very cool static effect. I think that people will be doing this in Commander a bunch. I don't think it's going to see play outside of Commander, but that's okay. It's a cool card. All right, next up, Tyrranax Rex. 7 mana, 8/8, Phyrexian Dinosaur. The spell can't be countered. Trample, Ward 4, Haste, Toxic 4. This is a lot of keywords. There's a lot of keywords. This thing's hard to kill. You know, like, this reminds me a lot of, like, Gaia's Revenge or Carnage Tyrant. Ward 4 is a ton, and can be countered is a big deal. Once this comes down, it's almost always going to stick, and it's almost always going to hit the opponent. The Toxic 4 you might be able to utilize alongside some other things like Proliferate, or you can play this at the top end of that Bloated Contaminator deck. You might want one of these in the sideboard. In fact, I think I had one in the sideboard, if I'm not mistaken. All right, well, in this deck, yeah, I did. Tyrranax Rex, right? So, as a 1/0 for the Vivian Arcbow Ranger seems pretty good. You just want a big dumb idiot sometimes that's hard to deal with. And this is a big dumb idiot that's hard to deal with. It is very scary. Yes, you can play this with creativity, and they're very hard to kill. And you can not feel so bad about playing more than 2 in your deck. Where if you play the Xenagos other combo, you can get hosed pretty hard by like the Wandering Emperor. This one, you could just play Gruul, just play 4 of these and put them back in your deck, and then you just go get a couple of them and kill your opponent, right? Most of the time. 3 of them is almost guaranteed lethal. 2 of them is really close to lethal. You can put extra copies back in your deck by pitching things. You can also just creativity for 1, and that's pretty good. Ward 4 is a ton. I want to be clear. Ward 4 is a ton. It's very hard to kill the 2 mana 1/1 artifact guy that has Ward 2 before it gets out of hand. And that thing can be hit with a Fatal Push. Ward 4 is crazy. That just means, like, every 2 mana removal spell that could kill this costs 6. If you're getting this onto the table on turn 4 with creativity, you're probably just going to kill your opponent before they can kill it. Ward 4 is basically hexproof. It's crazy. What's up, Cam? It is Friday. Is this better than Titan of Industry for creativity? It depends on if you want to kill your opponent or elongate the game. If you build your deck in such a way where you're playing like a control role, you can play Titan. But Tyrranax Rex ends the game. Like, it's quick. It makes some value, but it's fast. It's so enormous. It's just so big. I don't even really know what else to say. Mondrak Glory Dominus. So, Mondrak, 2 white for 4/4, legend, Phyrexian Horror. This is part of the Dominus Cycle. These are gods. Gods of Phyrexia, which to me just means they're large monsters that people worship that are very strong. I mean, if you look at the picture, this thing is terrifying, right? I want to see like a high-res image of this. Because if you look at it, this thing is like attacking a temple or just shattering a temple as it's like moving forward. I think that's what's happening. These are mouths that are just like screaming, I think. And these are just like guys that are worshiping it or whatever. I don't know. But so Mondrak is specifically good with tokens, right? You want to play Mondrak in a deck that's going to generate tokens because it generates extra tokens. You can spend 1 and 2 white or Phyrexian, sack 2 other artifacts or creatures and it gets an indestructible counter. That's a way to keep it alive. You can sack blood tokens or treasures or whatever. 4 life is a hefty amount, but you can do it in response to a removal spell, or you can just untap with it. The difference between this on 4 mana and 5 mana is pretty huge. It's so big that I wonder if they intentionally made it scale in a tremendous way if you just wait for 1 more mana. The difference between 4 and 5 mana in Magic is great. And playing a 4 mana 4/4 and 4 with an upside, you know, if you want to risk being able to untap with it, that's the thing you can do. Or you can just wait until you have your 5th mana so you can protect it with the sacrifice ability. I want to see this in a Mardu deck. I want to see this in Cat Oven. I want to see this with Oni Cold Anvil. There's a new Bitter Blossom that we're going to talk about later that goes well with this as well. And I did write about this card in one of my articles on my Patreon. But Mondrak is great, man. Just play it in a deck that generates a bunch of tokens. It's not that hard. You can play black-white. You can play red-white. You can play Mardu. I think that the black, white, and red are going to be your best bets for the color combinations. I don't think green or blue generate tokens that well. And so Mondrak's just not going to work that well with them. But I do think that Mardu, black-white, or red-white are going to be good with this card. Just look for it alongside Oni Cold Anvil and the Bitter Blossom. Skrull's Hive is the name of the card. We'll be talking about it soon. The blue Dominus is Tekathal, Inquiry Dominus, 2 and 2 blue for a 3/5 flyer. If you would proliferate twice instead. So if you're gonna play a deck that has a ton of proliferate things and like puts counters on a bunch of stuff, you can just play this. It's very difficult to kill. It gives you extra abilities of everything. It's also a legend. This feels like a pretty good commander for like mono blue proliferate, right? For Pioneer specifically, I don't know where this goes yet, but it's very powerful. I can't think of anything off the top of my head where this is great, but Thrumming Bird exists, right? And I know that there's plenty of cards that say proliferate on them in the set. It's just going to be interesting to see who breaks it first, because proliferating a second time is pretty clutch. There are cards that do triggers in this set too, based on proliferating, that are not counter oriented. So Drivnod Carnage Dominus, 3 and 2 black for an 8/3. That's a huge stat line. 8 power. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. So any die triggers trigger twice. That means your Stitcher Supplier type cards are all going to go again. And then black or Phyrexian hybrids, exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard, put an indestructible counter on it. So if you have 3 creature cards in your graveyard, when you play this, you can immediately give it indestructible, and your opponent won't be able to kill it via traditional means. What this means to me is you want to play this in a dedicated sacrifice deck featuring things like Priest of the Forgotten Gods. Now, maybe Drivnod is a forgotten god, right? So Priest is working with that pretty well. You can play it alongside, any sort of creatures that when you sack them, they do a thing. You can play it with things like, not Blood Artist, the Zulaport Cutthroats. There's all sorts of creatures that have like dice abilities or trigger when things do die. I don't think I want it in a token deck. I think I'd much rather play it. I mean, you can play cards that sack, like Blister Pod, for example. You can play Blister Pod, things like that. How does it work with Mayhem Devil? I think Mayhem Devil specifies when you sacrifice, so it's not technically a trigger when it dies. Because it doesn't say when something dies, you deal damage. And I think that it has to say when X dies, do a trigger. And Drivnod works with that specifically. What's up, Isaac? I'm doing pretty good, man. This card's cool. I do just like it with a bunch of things that have static sacrifice effects too. There's not... Is Nantuko Husk is legal, right? Or is it the other one? I know there's Nantuko Husk or the other one. It's 3 mana 2/2. You can sack a creature to get +2/+2. You can also play Woe Strider. There's just a lot of things that you can play that have static sacrifice effects. And you just play those alongside things like Zealport Cutthroat, and Drivnod just combo kills people. So I'll be interested in trying a deck with this, with Priest of Forgotten Gods. I'm curious if we can figure out what all should work with it in the deck. Sulfim, Mayhem Dominus, 4 mana 5/4. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. So we have a couple of cards like this, Mechanized Warfare. You know, like things that deal extra damage, but you got to do it in weird ways. Sulfim, Mayhem Dominus, you know, you can use it alongside things like Mayhem Devil, things that ping for 1 damage. Thermo Alchemist comes to mind. Non-combat means burn spells as well, so all your burn spells deal extra damage. I like that all your shocks immediately deal double. I think that things like that is pretty cool. You can play this alongside like Spikefield Hazard so that you can shrink the total number of lands you want to play while still having a high number of spells. Is this better than Torbrand? Probably not better than Torbrand, but certainly very cool. And it has the ability to get indestructible, and it's much bigger by itself, so perhaps it is better than Torbrand. I know Torbrand has some trouble in 2-color decks. This is a card that can easily slot into a Rakdos deck. You can have both, that's true. Next up, this is the Green Dominus. This one costs 7. It's got a lot of competition in green here. 7 mana 4/6 reach. Beginning combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn. So this is like a creature version of Unnatural Growth. And then 2 Phyrexian hybrid greens, sacrifice 2 other creatures. It gets an indestructible counter. So this is like okay because it can immediately gain indestructible. That's something you have to keep in mind when you look at the cost of these. Domini? I don't know. Some of them cost 1 and 2 hybrids, and some of them cost hybrid. The ones that cost hybrid are like secretly kind of messed up because the turn you cast them, you can just activate them. The black one specifically is great, and the green one's awesome too. Sacking 2 other creatures is a pretty big cost, though. The same way discarding 2 cards is a big cost. The reason why I like the black one is because you exile 3 creature cards from your graveyard. That's not a very big cost, right? Creatures go to the graveyard all the time from blocking, removal spells. You're going to be playing Priest of Forgotten Gods in this type of deck anyway. You're going to be able to put things into the graveyard, right? This one, 7 mana. It's pretty big. It doesn't have haste, it has reach, but it has virtual haste because everything that's in play gets that triggered ability, which is kind of sick. I don't really know. This is definitely a huge for Commander. I doubt it'll see any play in Pioneer. Maybe my favorite card in the set, the Eternal Wanderer. 4 white for a legendary Planeswalker. No more than 1 creature can attack the Eternal Wanderer each combat. So, that on its own, if you just play it for 6 mana and tick it up to 6, it's going to be very hard for your opponent to kill it. The +1, exile target artifact or creature. Return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of that player's next end step. So that means you blink your own thing, it comes back on your end step, you get the trigger. You blink your opponent's thing, it doesn't come back until their end step, which means it fogs it. It cannot attack for a whole turn cycle. That's a very powerful ability when you line it up with the other ability where no more than 1 creature can attack the Eternal Wanderer each combat. So you just exile their biggest thing, and then their second biggest thing probably can't kill the Eternal Wanderer. On a dry board, the 0, make a 2/2 double strike. -4 on a large board. For each player, choose a creature that player controls. Each player sacrifices all creatures they control not chosen this way. So your -4 is essentially the same thing as oh my god. The 5-mana white card. I talked about this the other day. I completely forgot the name of it. 5-mana white card from Origins. You choose a creature for each player. Everyone sacks the rest. Tragic Arrogance, yes. The -4 is essentially Tragic Arrogance, a very powerful ability. And so, on a 6-mana Planeswalker, you essentially just have a bunch of messed up abilities all rolled into one, which leads me to believe that this card's never going to die. But that's okay. No one ever kills Elspeth Sun's Champion either. And no one complains about that. I think that the difference between this card and Elspeth Sun's Champion is that the Sun's Champion is way better for a control deck, whereas this card's way better for a creature-based blink deck. You want to use the blink effect a bunch. You want to be able to wrath your opponent when the board gets sticky. And you want something that you can play on a dry board if your opponent plays a Supreme Verdict or whatever. You want to have this in the holster ready to go on the next turn. I think this card's great alongside things like Siege Rhino and Skyclave Apparition. You can play it alongside Reflector Mage and Ether Channeler as well. You can even play it in a deck that plays Elesh Norn, Mother of Machines. And the Eternal Wonder will continually blink stuff. I think this card's awesome. I don't even really know what else to say. Yes, you need like direct Planeswalker kill to eat this. Most of the time, Planeswalkers are attacked to death. It's going to be very difficult to attack the Eternal Wanderer to death. All right, next up, Mind Splice Apparatus. 3 and a blue artifact with Flash. Flash is a big deal here. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an oil counter on it. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast for each oil counter on this card. So, first and foremost, this card kind of reminds me of Wilderness Reclamation in a way. You have to spend essentially half of a turn to play it. Or you have to basically sack a whole turn to play it. Wilderness Reclamation, you could immediately recoup that mana with like a card draw spell or a removal spell. You can't quite do that with Mind Splice Apparatus, but you can make Mind Splice Apparatus work with different stuff. Wilderness Reclamation worked with instants. You know, that's why Nexus of Fate was so good with it. This works really well with sorceries. This is great alongside things like Auron's Epiphany. You want to play it with like Galvanic Iteration. Blink of an Eye is one that I really like with this type of card. Into the Royal, whatever. I don't know if they're both legal or not. Divide by 0 is a huge one because with this, Divide by 0 lets you have 2 different spells you can cast with it. And I think the trick with Mind Splice is just having spells that essentially count as 2 spells. So you essentially have 1 spell that gets a double discount. You can do a couple things to add counters to Mind Splice Apparatus. There's a card called Drowning Ichor. It's black and 1, sorcery, target creature gets -4/-4. And then you proliferate. There's also a 2-mana instant. Look at the top 3, put one in your hand. Proliferate, you can play alongside this. There's a land that lets you move counters from it, oil counters from it, onto Mind Splice Apparatus. I think all 3 of those cards could go alongside Mind Splice to make it do some really dirty stuff. And I would play this in a deck that does, just like blue instants and sorceries, basically. Counter spells of some kind. Things with a lot of colorless and the cost seem cool. Next up, Karmanix the Wrecking. 1BB, legendary creature Phyrexian Rat, Toxic 1. Other rats you control have Toxic 1. And when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal any number of rat cards from among them and put the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. The same for me. I don't really know. This goes in a rat deck, I guess. Y'all have fun playing with rats. Okay, next up. Koth, Fire of Resistance. 4 mana for 4 loyalty. It's a new Koth. +2, search your library for a basic mountain, put it in your hand. -3, deal damage to target creature equal number of mountains you control. -7, you can emblem with. Whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, this emblem deals 4 damage to any target. I think the ultimate is actually pretty sweet. The fact that it can go tick up mountain, -7, play mountain, deal 4. Pretty powerful because he doesn't die. However, as far as just like a planeswalker goes, this one is pretty on the weaker scale. When it comes down, it can kill a creature. That's kind of cool. But I think that just, it makes you play mono red, and it makes it so you can't play a ton of specialty lands. You can, You can, I guess. You just have to play, you know, 10, 15 mountains or whatever. Which is, I guess, not that hard. I don't like that it just incentivizes mono red. I don't like that it incentivizes basic mountains. I don't really know what else it could do or should do, though. Overall, I think it's just pretty weak. But that's okay. It's okay for things to be weaker, you know? You don't need every card to just break the doors open. Nice combo with Snow Mountains. I guess it does go get Snow Mountains, so you can't play it in Scred Red. It's a good call. Take up Proliferate Ult. That's true. You can do that, too. Does not seem that hard to ultimate, which is nice. So, Bloated Contaminator. We talked about this one already. I'll bring up the deck again in a second. But 3 mana, 4/4 trample, toxic 1. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you proliferate. So basically, whenever you attack, they get 2 poison counters, but also you just get to put an extra counter on all your stuff. So if you play Nissa, Ranger Class, Vivian, Voracious Hydra, you know, these are all cards that put counters on things. And then you use the proliferate to abuse these things. Not only can you tick up Vivian and Nissa to give them more loyalty, whenever they put counters on stuff, you get to double the counters. You get to double the counters from Ranger Class, and you get to double the counters on Ranger Class. And then, actually, can I get confirmation? Can you just like put a level counter on this or no? I don't know how level works. I thought you could freaking go crazy with it. But if you can't, that's a big deal. Gain the next level as a sorcery to add its ability. Maybe you can't. Maybe you can't add a counter. Maybe it's not a counter. Okay, I thought that, so it works with Ranger Class's first ability, but I guess it doesn't let you put counters on it to level up. I thought it might. That's kind of unfortunate. Anyway, we'll figure it out when we actually start playing with the card. It works with the whenever you attack, though, which is kind of nice, so I'm going to leave it at that. It also works with Burning Tree. Ice Wolf says it works. Okay, we'll figure it out later. It's fine. I think it works, though. Maybe it doesn't. But that's the type of deck that I want to play. Mono green beatdowns. Next up, we're gonna do this the Suns, White Suns Twilight. So when I actually read the lore behind these, and I think that's pretty cool. But basically, these are just statues, right? This is a big statue of Elesh Norn, and all the statues at a certain time of day, one of the Phyrexian or one of the suns will be like over the statue in such a way where it looks like the statue is doing something to the sun. In the White Sun's Twilight, Elesh Norn is offering the sun, you know, to the world. White Sun Twilight, YYX. You gain X life. Create X/1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with toxic 1, and this creature can't block. If X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures. Nice. Okay, cool. Howden says that it doesn't work with the level ups. That's fine. This card reminds me a lot of Martial Coup. If you've ever played Martial Coup, it was a card from Alara block that was basically just the same thing, but didn't gain life. The 1/1s could block. So you could play Martial Coup for 2, 3, 4, make a bunch of tokens, but it really got its money's worth when the game would go late, and you would just play Martial Coup for 5, 6, 7, 8. Destroy the board, make a bunch of tokens, and then your opponent would essentially have to Wrath or do the same thing. White Sun's Twilight's very similar to that. I like the life gain. I don't love that the Mites can't block. You know, like the fact that they can't block means it's really hard to parse exactly how strong this card's going to be until we see exactly what the Mites can do in combat. Because you can definitely swarm your opponent with the Mites, right? You can do X for 3 or 4 a couple times, not needing 7 mana. I wish this said destroy all other non-Mites. Non-other Phyrexian Mites. Destroy all non-Phyrexian Mites. That would have been nice. That way that the one, like, you can play one early and then you can play one late and it doesn't kill your Mites. But maybe that was too powerful. Next up, Blue Sun's Twilight. So this one is Jin Gitaxias, right? Jin Gitaxias is containing the sun. Jin Gitaxias is like a experiment guy, sciencey guy. He likes to control things. And so in this monument, he's holding the sun. He's capturing it. Blue X. Gain control of target creature with mana value X or less. If X is 5 or more, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Nice one. Yes, Evil Build Nye. So the black one, this is Sheoldred. Sheoldred is towering above the Black Sun. And the reason why Sheoldred towers above the Black Sun is because Sheoldred is all about being menacing. Sheoldred wants to appear larger than she is for intimidation purposes. And so her monument, because the Black Sun is so close to the planet, it's impossible for her statue to essentially be able to be holding it or combating it or whatever. It's so large. So she just makes the monument so large that it looks like it's surrounding it or becoming one with it. Up to one target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. If X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Nice. The fact that this is an instant is pretty cool. I don't know that this is better than March of other Wretched Sorrow, and it's very similar in what it does. I don't think this is going to see a ton of play, but maybe it does. Red Sun Twilight. This is one that they didn't preview until way recently. So this one is Vraska, right? And Vraska is an explorer and a loner. Vraska wants to be left alone, and he wants other people to leave each other alone. But maybe that's not right. I think that's what they said, though. He's like Vraska is like the Silver Surfer. You know, he's the precursor to all things Phyrexian. He's the one going out searching and spreading the word, right? It's all about freedom. Sure. All right. Lastly, Green Sun's Twilight. This is what's his face? Vorinclex. So sorcery, green and X. Reveal the top X plus 1 card to your library. Choose a creature card and or a land card from among them. Put those cards into your hand, the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, baseline, green and 1. Look at the top 2. Put creature and or land card from them into your hand. So if you get lucky, it's a 2-mana draw 2. It's pretty good. If X is 5 or more, instead put the chosen cards onto the battlefield or into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So, if you do it for a bunch, things come into play. So that's kind of cool. This thing scales really nicely, much better than the other ones, I think. I think that playing this for X equals 1 or 2 is pretty reasonable. I think that Desperation, playing it for X equals 0 is also fine. If Green Sun's Twilight is the only non-creature, non-land in your deck, playing this for 1 mana makes sense. But it's one of those cards that just the more mana you have, the better it's going to be. You look for more cards. If you spend 5 or more, you get to put them directly into play. And you get to put both into play. This could be kind of scary with something like Nykthos, but I don't think it's going to take the place of anything that's in the mono green deck right now. So, yeah, it does find Nykthos and a creature. So it's pretty scary. But I just don't think it's better than Oath of Nissa, because Oath of Nissa is a permanent. If Oath of Nissa were still banned, this card might be good. Next up, Skrull Deflector Might. This is essentially the new Mother of Runes. 1 white for a 1/1 Toxic 1. Can't block. Legendary Phyrexian Might. Phyrexian White, tap, choose a color. Another target creature you control gain Toxic 1 and Hexproof from that color until end of turn. It can't be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. So this gets around... So, long story short, this thing's a 1-mana 1/1 that taps to protect another creature. It pays some life. If you have white up, you can pay white, but it's usually 2 life, because you're going to want to tap out basically every turn. It's a legend, so you might not want to play 4, but it's very good. And the reason why Mother of Runes was so good, though, is because it was great in multiples as well. But this is not, because it's legendary. So could be that this one ends up seeing very little play because of that legendary clause. But I really like the build of it. Yeah, it's a great way to protect Greasefang. I do like that idea. That's cool. I didn't even think about that. But it's you know, it's Giver of Runes, it's Mother of Runes. It's the same thing, same type of card, and it's very efficient. Very efficient. It's more efficient than anything we have in Pioneer that does anything similar. We have, you know, the Indestructible Doggy, and we have All Seed of Life's Bounty or whatever. This is way better than both of those. Way, way, way better. I like that it gets hexproof, so that you don't turn off your own things like Insult Artifact or all the glitters. Next up, Encroaching Mycosynth. 3 mana, or sorry, 3 and a blue for an artifact. Non-land permanents you control are artifacts in addition to their other types. The same is true for permanent spells you control and non-land permanent cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. Okay, so this one is essentially just Mycosynth Lattice, but without the problematic stuff. So all your non-lands, yeah, it's basically just all your non-lands. So it just doesn't blow up, and it's only your stuff. It's not your opponent's stuff too. So this is essentially just one-sided Mycosynth for you, right? I believe that's true. Great Revel. So maybe this is part of a greater Karn combo, but I don't think so. I think the current one's good enough. Archfiend of the Dross, 2 BB for a 6/6 flyer. Very, very strong stats. It enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from it. Then if it has no oil counters on it, you lose the game. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, its controller loses 2 life. This card is fucking crazy. It is so easy to kill this card on your own so that it will never kill you. Let me be clear. This card is very similar to oh god, we played it the other day. The curse, the demonic pact. That's the one. So Archfiend Dross is essentially a creature version of demonic pact, right? But creatures are way easier to kill and sacrifice than enchantments. So like Archfiend is essentially just a really aggressive card that if your opponent happens to gain some life or do something that makes it not be able to attack, they might like force you to sacrifice it in some way. But Archfiend of Dross is enormous. This card is so freaking big. It deals extra damage to your opponent when their creatures die. The only downside is that on your 4th turn of owning it, you'll die. So, but you have 3 turns or whatever of attacking with it, right? So it goes, you play it, it has 4 counters. It goes to 3, it can attack. It goes to 2, it can attack. It goes to 1, it can attack. And then on the last turn, you die. So it gets to attack 3 times. Yeah, if they chump block, they lose 2 life. But it's also hard to chump block with the flyer, right? You don't have a lot of flyers in constructed most of the time. Yeah. Donate plus Heartless Act. That's a nice one. If people start playing Archfiend, I bet your ass they'll start playing Heartless Act to remove counters from it to try to steal games. Like other people will. That's funny. Glissa also takes its counters. Okay. I don't want to take its counters. I want to eat it. You can also proliferate onto it, right? But I think this will be like a pretty solid top end of an aggro deck. The aggro deck might have a couple things like Mukotai Soul Reaper, you know, to sacrifice it. Maybe it's a Woe Strider or something to just have a couple extra ways to sacrifice it. But for the most part, I think Archfiend of the Dross is just... It's crazy, man. It's a powerful card. If you copy, you just lose next upkeep. If you copy it, the copy will enter the battlefield with 4 counters, I believe. All right, next up is Vindictive Flamestoker. 1 red for 1/2, Phyrexian Wizard. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it. 6 in a red, sack it, discard your hand, then draw 4 cards. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each oil counter on Vindictive Flamestoker. Here's my problem with this card, chat. It works with Wizard's Lightning because it's a wizard. It's something that I've wanted for a while, more 1-drop wizards. But it's not very powerful in the early turns. 1/2 doesn't really attack well. Takes a long time for the ability to get going. I'm not going to play this with like Consider and stuff. I think that's a pretty bad way to build. However, you could play this in maybe Modern. Maybe Modern with Manamorphose and stuff, it's better. I do like it with Wizard's Lightning. I don't know what else I want to do with it though. This card is very Bedlam Reveler-esque, but I think much worse. Bedlam Reveler exists in the format, so I think I'd rather just play that. Yeah, if it got a little buff ski when you played a non-creature, that'd be fine. Or if it had +1 power equal to the number of oil counters on there or something. But as it is, I don't think it's good enough. All right, next up, Evolve Spinoderm. 2 and 2 green for a 5/5 Phyrexian Beast, rare. It enters the battlefield with 4 oil counters on it. has trample as long as it has 2 or fewer oil counters on it. Otherwise, it has hexproof. So the first 2 turns it has hexproof, and then the second 2 turns it has trample. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from it. Then if it has no oil counters on it, sacrifice it. This card's very similar to Blastoderm, Calciderm. We've seen these cards in the past. Just these big, you know, kind of like Shroud dummies that are hard to kill, but they go away after a few turns, so you can just chump block it a couple times. However, in this one, instead of chump blocking, you can only chump block the first attack, and then the second 2 attacks have trample. But after the first hit, it loses hexproof, so maybe you can kill it. It's a very interesting card. I doubt it'll see much play, though. But if it did see play, that wouldn't surprise me. Blastoderm was very good in its standard format. I just think that we're far past a 4-mana 5/5 being that scary. Even with hexproof. A 4-mana 5/5 hexproof, like, on rate, that's terrifying, I guess. But, like, it goes away after a while, so it's not going to be dominant. The decks that want it aren't, don't really exist, right? Not really. Next up, Norn's Wellspring. White and 1 for an artifact. When a creature you control dies, scry 1 and put an oil counter on it. 1 tap, remove 2 oil counters from it, and draw a card. So this one works well in sacrifice decks with tokens, things like that. I don't think that this is strong enough for Pioneer. I would be very glad to be proven wrong, though. I think that you're going to find that this card is going to be very similar to like Weatherlight Corrupted or whatever. But Weatherlight Corrupted is attacks, you know, and I think that that's the big difference. They're both very similar in what they do in their payoffs. I don't like that this one costs mana to remove the counters. I think that that means that it's just going to be a little too mana intensive. But this is probably awesome for something like Commander. Next up, Blade of Shared Souls. 2 and a blue. For Mirrodin, it's a new living weapon. You get a 2/2 Rebel and then it attaches to it. When this becomes attached to a creature, for as long as Blade of Shared Souls remains attached to it, you may have that creature become a copy of another target creature you control. So, kind of like a self-cloner. But it's a 3-mana 2/2 clone. And then you can move the Blade of Shared Souls around to become, have other things become a copy of that creature. I don't really know what kind of deck this should go in. There's maybe a combo with it somewhere. It seems pretty sweet. I love me some living weapon type cards, and this is a really nice one. Geth, Thane of Contracts. 1 BB for a 3/4 legend Phyrexian zombie. Other creatures you control get -1/-1. So, Geth does not play well with others. 1 BB, tap. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains. If this creature would leave the battlefield, exile instead of putting it anywhere else. Activate only as a sorcery. Note, it does not die end of turn. This is a permanent reanimate effect. That means you can bring back a Gristlebrand. You can bring back any large monster from the graveyard that you can put there. The thing that you don't want to play with Geth is a bunch of 1 toughness creatures. In fact, I would not play Geth with very many creatures at all. But just playing like some reanimate card seems pretty great. I don't know what to do with this in Pioneer specifically, but I'm sure there's some cool stuff you can do. Reanimate cards are always fun. I've had like Doom Necromancer in the past, so like cards like this don't really tickle my fancy that much anymore because I've just seen like Doom Necromancer just like never do anything. So like look how old this card is. This one was made in 10th edition, but the original one was from Onslaught. Return target creature card from your graveyard to play, right? Black tap sack. So this one's cheaper. The difference is that Geth doesn't sack itself. So, see, Worldspine isn't even that good with it either, right? Because it said if it would die, if it would leave the battlefield, you exile it. So it just like doesn't even really work. Next up, Slowbad Iron Golem. 2 and a red for a 3/3 Phyrexian Goblin Artificer. Tap, sack an artifact. Add an amount of red equal to the sacrificed artifact's mana value. Spend this mana only to cast artifact spells or cast activated abilities of artifacts. So I want to point out one thing someone showed me the other day. Slowbad is wearing Bosch. For those, many of you probably don't even remember Bosch. Bosch was like not a card that was very good for very long. But Bosch was one of those cards where in an era where Tinker was like one of the best things you could be doing in Constructed, and you could play 4 copies of Tinker, Bosch was one of the first artifacts they made that was big enough to win the game on its own without a lot of help. Before that, you had like Phyrexian Processor. But in Mirrodin, the first Mirrodin set, they gave us like Mindslaver and Bosch. And Mindslaver and Bosch actually just completely changed the Tinker decks and extended in such a way that it made it so that like Tinker needed to be banned. And before that, Tinker was certainly powerful and probably should have been banned at some point, but it really pushed it over the edge. But he's wearing, anyway, the thing about Slowbad is that he's wearing Bosch, is what I was told. So the fact that he's wearing Bosch is pretty funny to me. This card is a commander card. There might be something you can do with it in Pioneer. I think there's definitely something you can do with it in Modern, because you can play it alongside things like Mirror Enforcer and Frogmite. But the fact that you have to get the mana equal to its mana value means that in order to really break this, you need to like improvise or something. And I don't think it's going to be that good. So next up, Thrun Breaker of Silence, 5 mana, 5/5. Can't be countered. Legendary creature, Troll Shaman. Has Trample. It can't be the target of non-green spells your opponents control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control. And then as long as it's your turn, Thrun has Indestructible. So, 5 mana, 5/5, Indestructible attacker. You must Wrath it on your turn, or else it's going to eat you. That's it. You got to Wrath it. It's going to eat you. It's very scary for a control player. It's very scary for a mid-range player. You know? Edicts are going to be good against it. I think Shieldred's Edict's going to be great. I don't really know what deck this goes in, though. That's my big problem. I think maybe you sideboard it in mono green or whatever as a 2-of, maybe. All right, Kimba. Conjuring. 2 mana. Cat Cleric Legend. 2/2. Whenever it or another cat enters the battlefield under your control, attach up to 1 target equipment you control to that creature. Equipped creatures you control get +1/+1. 5 mana, created 2/2 white cats. Pretty cool card. I'll be interested to see if there's any other cats you want to play, or if this is a self-sustaining thing where you spend 5 and make a 2/2 and equip something to it. The fact that you immediately get something to attach Colossus Hammer to is pretty nice. I like this with some of the swords. Very excited to try this card in various equipment decks. Next up, Unctus Grand Metatect. This is a throwback to Grand Architect. 3 mana for a 2/4 legend, Phyrexian Vindicator. It's an artifact creature, it's important to note. It's a bird. Look at it. Other blue creatures you control have, when this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. Other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. Phyrexian/blue. Until end of turn, target creature you control becomes a blue artifact in addition to its other colors and types activate only as a sorcery. This probably has some sort of infinite combo attached to it. Usually when things start changing the color and types of stuff, you get some really dirty things, especially when there's statics of whenever this creature becomes tapped, draw on the discard. There's probably like something that you can equip, like a Paradise Mantle, so that you can like tap something for mana. So you want to do this with like a Pillow Pal or whatever, so you can untap it. Yeah, there's probably some sort of combo. I don't know. Phyrexian Arena. This is my pick for best card in the set. I think that this one will have a grand impact on Pioneer. Phyrexian Arena. It's a reprint. 1 BB. It's originally from Apocalypse. Enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and lose a life. That's it. Pretty clean, right? The downside of this card, obviously, if you're 1 life, you die when you draw a card. So your best bet, guess what? Play a bunch of things that gain life, right? My take on Phyrexian Arena is that this will not only revitalize the color black, but it will put black so far ahead of the competition that they may have to ban something. They may have to ban Shieldred. I don't know. That's my thing. That's what I think. I think Phyrexian Arena is the standard for extra cards, and in the past they've done similar things that have not come close. I'm very excited for Phyrexian Arena, and I will be playing it in a lot of different decks. Next up, Urbrass Forge. 3 mana artifact. Beginning of your combat on your turn, put an ult counter on it. Then create an X1 red Phyrexian with haste and trample, where X is the number of ult counters on it. And then you sack that token at the beginning of the next end step. So it starts as a 1/1, then it's a 2/1, then it's a 3/1, then it's a 4/1. And every turn, those attack and then die. And then attack and then die. And then attack and then die. So it's like Urbrash just sending out little scouts or whatever, right? And over time, the more oil counters it gets, the stronger the forge is. Very cool card. I doubt it'll see much constructive play, but it is cool that the creatures are artifacts, so you can find ways to use the bodies. Next up, Venerated Rot Priest, 1 mana, 1/2, Toxic 1, Phyrexian Druid. Whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. So, Venerated Rot Priest works really well with things like Ground Rift in Modern. I don't think it's going to see a ton of play in Pioneer, but I could be wrong. You know, there are things in Pioneer that can be, you know, abused with Venerated Rot Priest, I think. We'll just have to wait and see. I don't know exactly what we can do right now other than just targeting it with protection spells, but Cyber V, what's up, MT? Thanks for 19 months, friend. Welcome back to Todd Squad. This one I think is going to see some play in Modern, though. People are going to be doing some weird stuff. Yeah, Show of Confidence is a nice one. The problem with Pioneer is that there's not a lot of free spells, so even if there is something with Storm, it's not really going to do a ton. This card seems sweet, though. All right, next up, Skrell's Hive. 1 and a white. Beginning enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you lose a life and create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So the Mites are all just these little guys that can't block, but they kind of swarm over time and kill your opponent with poison damage. This one says, as long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. So with Skrell's Hive, I want to use this with the white Dominus because it makes double counters. Eventually, though, you're going to be able to recoup the life loss from the Skrell's Hive. The problem is that the creatures can't block. So if your opponent's playing an aggressive deck, they're going to swarm you pretty badly, and Skrell's Hive can't protect you from that. So that's something that we need to keep in mind. But overall, I really like this card, and I think it's going to see some play. I think it's going to need its own archetype, though, but something like black-white tokens is definitely viable. Next up, Mercurial Spell Dancer. This is one that's really attractive to me. 2 mana, 2/1 Phyrexian Rogue. Can't be blocked. When you cast a non-creature spell, put an oil counter on it. And when it deals combat damage to a player, you may remove 2 oil counters from it. If you do, when you cast your next instant or sorcery spell this turn, copy that spell. You may choose new targets for the copy. So you can play this in a deck that plays a bunch of Considerers and Strangles and lightning strikes and removal spells and things like that. You can play this alongside things like Thoughtseize or Dig Through Time or whatever. Instants and sorceries are pretty easy. And each time you play a cheap one, this one gets a counter. But it's a 2 mana 2/1 that can't be blocked. This card gives me like big Snapcaster Mage vibes, but it kind of just sits around for a while. And so if your opponent kills, it's not going to do anything. I guess it's way more like a Glint Sleeve Siphoner. This one feels a little more like Glint Sleeve Siphoner. Thought it was a Merfolk at first glance. Probably should have been a Merfolk. Probably should have been. Cygnus says Skrell's Hive looks good with the wedding announcement. That's true. It's true. Yeah, unblockable rogue. I know. I guess there's a couple of rogue strategies you can do with it. But mostly I just think playing it with a bunch of Considerers and Shocks and stuff is going to be good. Variant Executioner Thane's up next. 2 mana, 2/2 Legend, Phyrexian Vampire. When 1 or more other creatures you control die, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This ability triggers only once each turn. So this is an easy one of in all those sacrifice decks we were talking about earlier with the Black Dominus and Priest of Forgotten Gods and stuff. This is a pretty powerful ability, and it's one you can do on your opponent's turn and on your turn. So I like that you can kind of get that drain 2 pretty quickly in a turn cycle. I really like that this isn't constant, though. I think if it were Blood Artist or whatever, where it could just trigger a million times on one turn, it would be kind of ridiculous. And so it's fine that it's a legend, right? Because you can just play a couple. The second one is not that bad either, because you can just cast the second one and it drains your opponent for 4. It's not just 2 because both of them will trigger. So I like maybe trying this in multiples. I like this in a sack deck. I think this card's very good. Next up, Dragonwing Glider. 5 mana equipment for Mirrodin. equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has flying and haste. So immediately right out of the gate, you get a 5-mana 4/4 flying haste. Pretty powerful stuff, if you ask me. And then if your creature ever dies, you get to re-equip it, and the equipped creature gets +2/+2 flying and haste. This is going to be pretty good, I think, in some of the Equipment Matters decks. Not only do you get to equip the creature instantly with things like Kimba, right? So you can play alongside Kimba. So if your creature dies, you play Kimba, and the equipment immediately attaches to her and gives her +2/+2 haste and flying, and a +1/+1 from her ability. So I think it could be good with Kimba. I really like all the Mirrodin cards. I think they're all pretty cool. I don't know if they're broken yet, but they're good. Next up, Conduit of Worlds, 4-mana artifact. You may play lands from your graveyard. That's a pretty powerful effect. That's already Crucible of Worlds, right? And then tap. Choose target non-land permanent you control in a graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. You can play a land from your graveyard and then cast a spell from your graveyard. Conduit of Worlds is very strong. It's very similar to Yawgmoth's Agenda, a card from Apocalypse or Invasion Block that was extremely powerful back in its heyday. In Block Constructed, this was the best card. In Standard, it was one of the best cards. Essentially, you just got to play a removal spell or a sweeper on your turn, and then a counter spell or removal spell on your opponent's turn. And you got to play a bunch of lands out of your graveyard that you discarded with things like I can't remember the name of the card. It was like draw 3, discard 2, and then if you pay black and 1, your opponent discards 2 as well. Yes, Probe. That's right. It was called Probe. It was a 3-mana draw 3, discard 2, and then you could kick it so your opponent discarded 2. But you played that to kind of filter your hand, and then when you played Yawgmoth's Agenda, your graveyard was just full because of Probe. But Conduit of World seems pretty cool. I think this card's going to be very good. We're going to be moving into commons and uncommons, so we're going to go pretty quick. So 4 mana against all odds, sorcery. Choose one or both. Exile target artifact or creature you control. Return to the battlefield under its owner's control. Return target artifact or creature cards with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So if you got a bunch of stuff dead and something in play, you get a bunch of blinks. This card's very cool. I don't really know the type of deck that's going to want this specifically. But even in something like Greasefang, right, you can bring back a Greasefang. But you can also just like blink a Chariot that you have in play. I don't know. Probably not that good in that type of deck, but it seems sweet. This is one that looks cool. Armored Scrap Gorger. 2 mana 0/3. Tap, add 1 mana of any color. It gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters. And then whenever it becomes tapped, you exile target card from a graveyard and put an oil counter on Armored Scrap Gorger. I think that this might be the best uncommon in the set for limited, and it might be the best uncommon in the set in general. I think this card's awesome. It's like a Scavenging Ooze that's a mana producer. It doesn't die to Stomp. It doesn't die to Shocks. It gets bigger when the game goes later. It's very good. Eat, sort, eat, sort, eat. Yes. Nice. Nice flavor text. NX Entry is one that I do want to talk about a little bit because I think it's cool. For 3 mana, you get a 1/4 Phyrexian Cleric artifact creature. Has Toxic 1. When it enters the battlefield, exile target artifact or creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less until it leaves the battlefield. An important thing to note on this card, 4 toughness is a ton. Not a lot of cards that do this type of effect have more than 3 toughness, which means they always died to red removal. This one doesn't. I think that's a big deal. It's also an artifact, so you might want this in a deck that plays like the 2 mana 1/1 that looks at the top 4 and grabs an artifact. I forgot what it's called. Yeah, this looks great in like artifact aggro. Minor Misstep. This is an interesting one because it's a callback to Mental Misstep. Counter target spell with mana value 1 or less. So Mental Misstep was exactly 1. This being 1 or less means you can use it to counter things like Living End, you know. But mostly you're just going to use this in like a control deck in Modern to counter 1-drops. I don't know how good it's going to be. I thought it might be pretty good in Legacy, but the more I think about it, the more that it's maybe not good enough. It's certainly not good enough for Pioneer. All right, here's another one that's awesome. Canker Bloom has also got a sweet name, and there's a bunch of arts for it that's great. So there's a Phyrexian Fungus, green and 1 for a 3/2. So in 1 mana, sack it, choose 1, destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or proliferate. This card is very similar to Outland Liberator, Cathar Commando. It's a 3/2 for 2 mana. This is better than all those, I think. It's very, very strong. Very, very, very strong. I like this card a lot. We still have a bunch of multicolor things to talk about, but I want to go over some of the uncommons that I think are going to be good. Evolving Adapted, 1 green for 0/0. Enters the battlefield with an oil counter on it, and it gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it. Whenever another creature you control enters the battlefield, if that creature has power or toughness, greater power or toughness than Evolving Adaptive, put an oil counter on it. So this doesn't work well with Hardened Scales, but it does work well with Winding Constrictor, because Winding Constrictor only cares about counters. It doesn't care about +1/+1 counters. So you can play this with Puck Collector and Experiment 1, but you can't really play it with Scales, which is kind of a bummer. Drown and Iker, black and 1 for sorcery. Target creature gets -4/-4, and proliferate. This card is pretty cool. Don't really know what else to say. older version, 3 mana. Target creature gets a -1/-1 counter, then proliferate. You can see they're scaling pretty well on the playability of these cards, right? Spread the Sickness was 5 mana, destroy creature, proliferate. This is essentially the same thing. It only costs 2. This card's awesome. I want to try this with the artifact that we talked about earlier, the Mind Splice apparatus. I want to try putting counters on this thing, playing it with instant and sorceries that do that. And but you can play this in like Golgari Scales as well, right? Like this is just a very cheap removal spell that you can play in a 2-color deck that has Proliferate Matter stuff. So next up, Distorted Curiosity, 3 mana, draw 2, but it has Corrupted. It costs 2 less if they have 3 or more poison counters. I don't know if this card's going to be good, but it gives me of 1 Mind vibes, and I'm pretty excited to see if we can do anything cool with it. So this is the new cancel variant. It's 3 mana, counter a spell. If that spell's mana value is 3 or less, you get to proliferate. This is another thing that works with Mind Splice Apparatus. This is just another one of those cards that's 3 mana, counter spell, do a thing. Proliferate's a very powerful thing if you can utilize it. Expand the Sphere. 3 and a green, sorcery. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. Put up to 2 land cards from among them into the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you put fewer than 2 lands onto the battlefield this way, proliferate a number of times equal to the difference. So this is a card that is essentially a split card, right? Because you can choose to fail to find the lands. That's something that they don't tell you. You can choose to put the lands into play, and if you don't, you proliferate. So if you miss, you proliferate, or you can choose to proliferate by just not putting the lands into play. I like it a lot. Serum Snare is kind of cool. 2 mana, return a non-land permanent to owner's hand. Then if the permanent had mana value 3 or less, proliferate. Very similar to the other counterspell we just looked at. Similar to Fading Hope, honestly. Infectious Bites. One of your creatures bites an opposing creature, and then each opponent gets a poison counter. I don't like that this can't hit Planeswalkers. I like bites being able to hit Planeswalkers. Maybe an oversight, maybe on purpose. Ossification's excellent. White 1, enchant land, or basic land you control. Exile target creature or Planeswalker an opponent controls until Ossification leaves the battlefield. This will go really well with the quad white Phyrexian Obliterator. With Phyrexian Vindicator, you have to play a ton of planes already. So you can just play 4 Ossification. Works really nicely in this kind of mid-range strategy. All right, here's one that's nice. Tamiya's Logbook. 3 mana artifact. 6 tap, draw card. This ability costs 1 less to activate for each other artifact you control. So it itself doesn't have affinity for artifacts, but you can play this alongside a bunch of cheap artifacts and just have a draw engine for blue. I think that's pretty cool. I like that it's her logbook, but it's infected now. Tyvar stands pretty sweet. 1 green and X instant. Target creature you control gets +X/+X and gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. So baseline 1 green. Target creature gets hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. That's pretty good. Your opponent goes for Wrath of God, you save a guy. Your opponent goes for Doomblade, you save a guy. When you have a bunch of mana and you want to go for the kill, guess what? It gets +X/+X. This is also like a split card. It's very cool. This is an equipment that I think is interesting to talk about. This is not a Mirrodin equipment. This is a Phyrexian equipment. 2 mana. Equip creature gets +2/+0. Costs equip for 3. And then whenever equip creature attacks, you get a 1/1 might. And the mites can't block. But you can just get another body for it. And so it kind of creates this like slow infinite chain of 1/1s that kind of just mindlessly attack into your opponent. But if your opponent has 3/3s or less, then it's great, right? This seems like way more of a limited card, but I do like the card itself. Scheming Aspirant's one that I made reference to earlier that I think could be good. 2 mana 1/3. Whenever you proliferate, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. So this is kind of like a weird sidestepper for proliferate. Normally with proliferate, you want to have only cards that have counters on them so that proliferate gets to do the thing. But Scheming Aspirant is essentially the same thing, right? It just doesn't specifically have counters. It just does another thing, but that thing is certainly powerful, especially with a constant source of proliferate like the Vraska. A Natural Restoration, another thing that just looks like a normal card with proliferate attached. Green and 1. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, proliferate. So, yeah, just bring back a thing and proliferate. That's pretty powerful stuff. Proliferate's a good ability, and a lot of these cards just look like normal-ass cards that have a good ability on them, you know? Next up is my pick for best card in the set, Sheoldred's Edicts. Maybe the second best card in the set behind Phyrexian Arena. It's unclear. They're going to go in the same decks. It doesn't matter. Choose one. Each opponent sacks a non-token creature. Each opponent sacks a creature token. Each opponent sacks a planeswalker. So long story short, you get 3 abilities for 2 mana, instant speed, and all 3 abilities can be relevant and can be controllable. Normal edict effects like Diabolic Edict, the original, your opponent can just sacrifice a token. This prevents that. It's not going to get their biggest thing necessarily. It's going to get their worst thing, but it's going to get their worst thing either among tokens or among non-tokens. But it's a 2 mana removal spell that can also hit planeswalkers with ease. And the thing about planeswalkers is that they're always... Sorry, it's rare that your opponent's going to have more than one planeswalker in play. The reason why Ingrass Rampage was so weak when it was in Standard was because A, there was a ton of tokens, B, it was a sorcery, and C, it was 2 colors. And so instead of all that, we just get a pretty clean 2 mana card that just has a ton of awesome text on it that you get to really sequence it how you like, right? You can combine this with, you know, all your other removal spells to essentially turn Sheoldred's Edict into a real removal spell. But it's a split removal spell, and it's an instant, and it's 1 color. So I think it's going to be very good. Next up, Revel Salvo. 2 red instant. Deals 5 damage to target creature, planeswalker. That permanent loses indestructible until end of turn, and then has affinity for equipment. So for every hammer you play, it costs 1 less. Sword costs 1 less. There's a lot of equipment in the set. 3 mana, deal 5 has been fairly commonplace. I love that this can be reduced. And I love that you can play it with Obosh. Seems pretty cool. All right, next up, Nahiri the Unforgiving. So for red-white, 1 and a Phyrexian red-white, you get a planeswalker with 5 loyalty with completed. So if you pay 3 mana, it comes in with 3 loyalty. That's important to note. +1 until your next turn. Up to 1 target creature attacks a player each combat if able. +1, discard a card, then draw a card. If you have no cards in hand, you draw a card. 0, exile target creature or equipment card from with mana value less than Nahiri's loyalty from your graveyard. That's less than. So if you play it for 3 mana, you cannot immediately return a Greasefang from your graveyard to the battlefield. You must do that at 4 mana or on the following turn. That token gains haste, exile at the beginning of the next end step. So long story short, Nahiri, I think it's going to go really well in like a Mardu Greasefang deck. I built one in my article. You can check it out on my Patreon right now. But long story short, I think this card's great. It's got a lot of play to it. You can use it in a number of different strategies. Mardu Sacrifice. You know, you can bring back things like Priest of Forgotten Gods, random creatures that you want to sacrifice. I think this card's great. Next up, Lukka, Bound to Ruin. Another card that I did a Pioneer Spotlight on this one last week. But this is a 5 mana Lukka. 5 loyalty has completed for one of the green reds. The fact that it's a different mana symbol on each of the top numbers and pips is that means that you can play it with Gigantha. You can also play with Obosh, so it works well with both of the potentially Gruul companions. The +1 is add green red. Spend this ability only to cast creatures or activate abilities of creatures. -1. Create a 3/3 green Phyrexian Beast creature token with Toxic 1. And then -4, it deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of creatures or planeswalkers, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control as you activated this ability. So, Lukka comes down if you have a left stroke beast in play, can minus immediately and deal 5 spread across your opponent's stuff, and survive. Surviving is a huge deal there. I think this is going to go great in a bunch of Gruul decks. I think it can work well with either Obosh or Gigantha, so I'm excited to try both. But mostly, I just think Left Stroke Beast is the money because it's hard to kill. It's a 5/5, so you're going to play Lukka. If you play it for 5 mana, you get to immediately minus and just destroy your opponent's board. But you can also cast it for 4 mana, and that's pretty cool in a Gigantha deck, or in an Obosh deck, rather. Now, next up is Kaito Dancing Shadow. 2 blue, black, 3 loyalty. Whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you may return one of them to its owner's hand. If you do, you may activate loyalty abilities of Kaito twice this turn rather than only once. So, long story short, if you have a little 1 mana rogue in play or whatever, you can return it. And then you can do Kaito's twice. You can draw 2 cards, or you can make a 2/2 and draw a card, or you can make a creature not be able to attack or block and draw a card, or you can make 2 creatures not be able to attack or block. A lot to love about Kaito. Very hard to kill because of the +1. And if you are aggressive alongside it, there's just a lot of cool stuff you can do. I was a big fan of the original Kaito from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. And this one looks like a nice successor. Costs 1 more mana, but it does a lot more stuff. It's way better at being defensive. And in general, I think the abilities are all just very good. So, very excited to try this card out. Next up, Phyrexia Grand Unifier. This is non-red and 3. 7 total mana. Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink. 7/7, that's enormous. When it enters the battlefield, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand, with the rest on your bottom of your library in a random order. This is important to note because they have insinuated that a battle is a card type, and we don't know what battle is until at least another set. They've already told us that. This card plays very similarly to Niv Mizzet Perun. I think that is it Perun? Or Niv Mizzet 5 color one. And but I think Niv Mizzet is just better. I don't think this card's going to see a ton of play in Pioneer. People are going to play the shit out of it in Commander. Just a big dumb Commander card. Oh, I guess it is a 7-drop, so you can do this with Neoform. That's true. But I don't think you want to Neoform into a fair card. You want to Neoform into a card that kills your opponent, like Velmachus. But maybe it's good. Maybe you can play it in like a more fair Neoform deck, but who knows. Next up, Kaya Intangible Slayer. 7 mana Planeswalker for black and white. Has hexproof. +2, each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. That's pretty powerful. Immediately ramping up to 8. Has hexproof, so you can't kill it other than attacking it. 0, you draw 2 cards, then each opponent may scry 1. And then -3, exile target creature or enchantment. If it wasn't an aura, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 white spirit creature with flying in addition to its other types. So this card's bonkers, you know? Like, it's hard to kill, has a lot of abilities. Just on a dry board, it's unbeatable. And on a gummed up board, it's very good still, because it lets you kill a thing and make a 1/1. I don't know. This card's bananas. Tyvar Jubilant Brawler. 1 black and a green for a 3 loyalty Planeswalker. You may activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. +1, untap up to 1 target creature. -2, mill 3 cards. Then you may return a creature with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Tyvar is incredible. This card is incredible. You need some very specific stuff for it to be broken. You need things like Heritage Druid, or not Heritage Druid, Devoted Druid, or Prime Speaker Vanifar. Things that let you activate immediately are going to be incredible. But both the other abilities are also just good. You know, the untap a creature to activate for another mana is pretty sweet. You can use this alongside anything that generates 2 mana, and it's going to be broken. But the -2 to bring something back from the graveyard is also just awesome. And the fact that you can do that, and then the creature has virtual haste, means that if they kill your Devoted Druid, you just bring it back and do it again. So, big fan of Tyvar. I think it's going to be excellent in Modern, and I'm hoping that it sees some play in Pioneer alongside Vanifar, or someone might break something with it outside of that. Love this card, though. So, red white for a 2/2 Trampler, Human Rebel. Not a lot of rebels that we've seen recently. Whenever it attacks, it gets +X/+X, where X is the number of equipped creatures you control. Then if its power is 4 or greater, draw a card. I'm not so sure that this goes into an equipment deck, weirdly as that sounds. I kind of just want to put a Rancor on this and attack for 4 and draw a card, right? I don't really know what to do with this card. I don't think it's very good. But I'm very happy to be proven wrong. You can put this in an Equipment Matters deck if you want. Next up, Malcator Purity Overseer. This is one that I'm very excited about. 3 mana 1/1 Phyrexian Elephant Wizard. It's legendary. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. Then at the beginning of your end step, if you made 3 or more artifacts this turn, you get another 3/3. So when you're doing big blink chains with Thraven Inspector, Charming Prince, Yorion, you get to blink this and just make like a bunch of extra tokens. You can also use it alongside any sort of blink effect in general to just treat it like a Blade Splicer. Blade Splicer is excellent. It's been a valid part of Legacy for a long time, up until recently, where Initiative took over, and in a lot of the Aethervial decks, it's been great in Modern before. I think that you can put this in a lot of similar decks where you'd want Blade Splicer, and it's going to be great. And in Pioneer specifically, it works really well with Yorion, the new Elesh Norn, and Eldrazi Displacer. And you can also play like Touch of the Spirit Realm or whatever too, and it's still good. So big fan of Malcator. Next up, Reavor, Bane of Bladehold. 4 mana 3/4, Battle Cry. Whenever this creature attacks, each other attacking creature gets +1/+0 until its turn. At the beginning of combat on your turn, the next time target creature would deal combat damage to 1 or more players this combat, prevent that damage. If damage is prevented this way, create that many 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. So the moment you play it, you target a creature you control, it hits the opponent, you get some tokens. And then on the next turn, it has Battle Cry. So this card reminds me a lot of Hero of Bladehold, obviously. This is just supposed to be a toxified version of Hero of Bladehold. The reason why Hero of Bladehold was so powerful is because it was a standalone card, and it was mono white. So for 2 white and 2, you got a 3/4 with Battle Cry. That whenever it attacked, it made 2 1/1s, and those creatures got +1/+0. This is very similar, but worse. All right, next up, Izuri, 4 mana 3/3, Phyrexian Elf Warrior Legend. When it enters the battlefield, you may pay 3. If you do, proliferate twice. When you proliferate, draw a card. So for 7 mana, it's a 3/3 that draws 2 and proliferates twice. But for 4 mana, you just play it, and then whenever you proliferate, you draw a card. Seems pretty sweet. It scales nicely. I like cards that scale. Glissa Sunslayer, 3 mana 3/3 Legend, Phyrexian Zombie Elf. First Strike Death Touch. So it's very difficult to block, essentially unblockable. When it deals combat damage to a player, choose one. You draw a card and you lose life. Destroy target enchantment. Remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. A very interesting card. I don't understand her place in this universe. You know, she's a Phyrexian zombie elf, but she's not part of the other Phyrexians, I don't think. I think she was an elf that lived on Mirrodin. Maybe she got corrupted. But removing the 3 counters seems like she's healing everything instead of killing everything. So I don't really know. I think that she's good. I think that she's a good guy, but it's weird that she's a Phyrexian zombie, but she's a good guy. But it seems like she's a good guy. Next up, Venture Corpse Puppet. Blue-black for 1/3. Lifelink, Toxic 1, Phyrexian Zombie Wizard. That's it. That's all the text on the card. There is more text on the card, but it requires an immense amount of effort. When you proliferate, you get a 3/3, or that 3/3 gains lifelink and flying. It is not easy to proliferate. It might be easy and limited. It's not going to be that easy and constructed to proliferate. You can play this with a number of things that do proliferate, but the payoff, again, is not a proliferate payoff, right? We talked about the black creature earlier, that when you proliferate, you drain your opponent for 2. You're starting to see a mechanic that's like triggering for trigger's sake instead of doing the thing it's supposed to do. And Venture Corpse Puppet is another one of those payoffs for proliferate that doesn't really work in a proliferate deck. It doesn't scale, right? It just makes a 3/3 and then that thing gets flying and lifelink sometimes. I'm not a huge fan of this card, although it is interesting, but it is not good. All right, next up, 2-mana 3/3, Malaria the Living Cure. 2-mana Human Scout, legendary creature for green-white. If you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get only 1, and you can't get an additional poison counters this turn. You may exile it to choose another target creature or artifact. When that card is put into a graveyard this turn, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. So, very similar to Safi Eric's Daughter, if y'all remember that one. This is a 2-mana 3/3 that you can sack to essentially put a protective barrier on something, but you can also use it aggressively. I feel like there has to be some combos with this, but maybe not. Maybe it's just because it exiles itself, it's just a protective thing. Fix Safi. Yeah, fix Safi had a bunch of infinite combos. I guess this is fixed because it exiles itself. Ovika Enigma Goliath. 7-mana 6/6 flyer, ward 3, and pay 3 life. Just so much. It's basically 7-mana unkillable, 6/6. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create an X/1/1 red Phyrexian goblins. Rex a mana value. They gain haste until end of turn. They don't go away, though. That's important to note. I don't really know where this card is supposed to fit, because it's not better than something like Hullbreaker Horror. So I guess it's just for Commander, you know? That's what they're telling me. Every single card they make that says Legendary on it, it's probably a Commander card, man. Just leave me alone. At the beginning of your incept, Catholic Crucible Goliath. Trying to get ahead of myself. 2 black-red for a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast Legend. Beginning of your incept, you may sack another creature. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card with lesser mana value. Put it onto the battlefield. Then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. Okay. I don't like that this is sack another creature. I like cards like this where you can sack them to have like a controlled thing. But I guess they didn't want another Cascade debacle. So, I don't know. Catholic seems fine. It's just like reverse Birthing Pod or whatever. Just weird. It's just like cool for a sack deck. I just don't really know if it's not supposed to go in like a Mayhem Devil deck or whatever. So, all right, next up, Miglow's Maze Crusher. Miglow's Maze Crusher is a 4/4 for 1 green-red. It's a Phyrexian Beast Legend. Enters the battlefield with 5. Count them, 5 oil counters. That's a ton of oil counters. 1. Remove 1 oil counter from it. It gains Vigilance and Menace until end of turn. 2. Remove 2 oil counters from it. It gets +2/+2 until end of turn. 3. Remove 3 oil counters from it. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. This card's awesome. No notes. Most Gruul decks are just going to play a couple of these in the 3-drop slot. This is great in a Collected Company deck. It's great in an aggressive deck. It's very similar to oh man. This is funny. I gotta show y'all my play mats. Is the card I was about to talk about. Savage Knuckleblade. Savage Knuckleblade and this card are very similar in what they do. They have a ton of abilities, and they're 3 mana and they're 4/4. The difference is that Miglaws can be cast off Llanowar Elves pretty easily, whereas Savage Knuckleblade cannot. And so in Pioneer specifically, you're going to see this in Gruul decks, and you're going to see it a lot. I think that's a ton of abilities that are all pretty good, and on a creature that's got a good rate, 3 mana, 4/4. You know, I like that it can get buffed, so it's harder to block. I like that you can make it have menace, so it's harder to block. And then if your opponent has an artifact enchantment that needs to be dealt with, you can, and it still has ult counters left over after that. Yeah, I think this card's great. Excited to try 1 or 2 in most of my decks. They actually previewed this one super late. I didn't even know about it until recently, but I like this card a lot. Voidwing Hybrid, blue and black for 2/1. Phyrexian Bat has flying and toxic 1. And then whenever you proliferate, return Voidwing Hybrid from your graveyard to your hand. So a very hard to kill creature that whenever you proliferate can come back. And yeah, it doesn't have death touch, so it's not going to be like broken or whatever. But this card is very cool. It is in the realm of what I like to call a relentless threat. Relentless threats are very similar to like Scrap Heap Scrounger and things like that. The fact that this has flying is kind of cool. The fact that you can use it defensively is also very cool. Charforger, black red 1 for a 2/3. When ETBs, you get a 1/1 goblin. And then whenever another creature artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, put an oil counter on it. And then you can remove 3 oil counters from it and exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. So this card works well in like Rakdos Sack decks. I might play like 1 or 2 in your Mayhem Devil decks. Seems pretty sweet. Sindri is also good. This one, the Flyer. I don't think so. 4 mana Flyer. It's like big or whatever, but like we have Crackling Drake, right? We don't need this shit. Crackling Drake's way better than this shit. Costs 4 mana. Doesn't do anything when ETBs. It's good, but it's like limited good. It's not like constructed good. Next up, Slaughter Singer, 2/2 for green-white, toxic 2. Interesting because this is one of the few toxic creatures that can actually kill your opponent before they take real damage. That's not a might. Whenever another creature you control with toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 till end of turn. So this works well in the Skrulls Hive deck if you want to build a Skrulls Hive deck. Sword of Fortune Frontier. This is a very sweet sword. Very good compared to some of the ones they printed in the last few years. I'm a big fan of this one. Protection from red's a big deal because it protects you from most of the premier removal spells in the format. Pro green also makes it so big shitters like Old Growth Troll can't block. I think that's also a huge deal. I want to put this on Llanowar Elves, and I want to slam in for some damage, and I want to play some extra lands. And I want to use those lands to play companions, activate abilities of lands, and just play bigger spells. I think that this can go great in a Gruul deck or a mono green deck, or maybe even a green blue deck. You can play this in like blue green Eldrazi maybe. I don't know. Seems sweet though. Like to play one in Pio Hammer. Yeah, I think that a lot of the Equipment Matters decks are going to want this. I think this card's just good. Next up, the Unplayable Staff of Completion. I say unplayable. It's probably great in like, I don't know, Commander. When you have 40 life. It's not very good when you have 20 life. Tap, pay 4 life, draw a card is not real. You can't do that, man. Just can't. Tap, pay 1 life, destroy permanent you own. That's nothing. Tap, pay 2 life, add 1 mana of any color. That's way too much. It should have been the other way around, probably. Tap 3, proliferate. That's fine. 5 on tap's fine. This card is just kind of meh. Next up, Filigree Silex. This is just Ratchet Bomb with extra steps. No two bones about it. Might be good in a card sideboard, but nothing really big deal. Like, it's an upgrade to Ratchet Bomb, but not by a lot. Monument to Perfection. This is a weird one. 2 mana artifact, 3 tap, search your library for a basic land, sphere, or locust land. Reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. They have made a couple new spheres that are kind of cool. We'll talk about those in a minute. Spend 3, Monument to Perfection becomes a 9/9 Phyrexian construct artifact creature. Loses all abilities and gains Indestructible and Toxic 9. Activate only if there are 9 or more lands with different names among the basic sphere and locust lands you control. So, a weird one. I doubt it'll see any play, but it's certainly cool. I like it as a generator for cards, right? 3 tap, search your library for a land. This is something that we've had in the past before. Just to like I forgot what it was called, but there's like a 2-mana artifact that was like 3 tap, look for a land to put in your hand. This is a huge upgrade to that. Grouse the Juggernaut, 8 mana legendary Juggernaut. Haven't seen a legendary Juggernaut before. That's kind of cool. It attacks each combat of Fable. Juggernauts can be blocked by walls. Other creatures you control have base power and toughness 5/3 and are Juggernauts in addition to their other types. So this card turns all your guys into Juggernauts. And we all know Juggernauts got to attack. Cool card. Tap at a completion, 2 mana artifact. Tap, put an oil counter on it. Tap, add a colorless. Activate only if there are 2 or more oil counters on it. 1 tap, draw a card. Only activate if there are 5 or more oil counters on it. If you got time, this card's great. If you got Proliferate, this card's awesome. I think this card could be very good. It's just a little wonky because it doesn't tap for mana until the 3rd turn you've controlled it or whatever. So it's a little slow. You know, most of the time when you have a mana rock like this, you want it to be able to activate the next turn. And that's just not the case here, but it probably should be. Very cool card, though. Reminiscent of Mind Stone, but maybe worse. Probably worse. All right, next up, Zenith Chronicler. 2 mana 3/1. Whenever a player casts their first multicolored spell each turn, each other player draws a card. So it's like punishment for multicolor. I like where their head's at building this kind of a card, but it's just not good. Argenta Masticore, 5 mana 5/5. First strike for a multicolor. Beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice it unless you discard a card. When you discard a card this way, destroy target non-land permanent an opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to the mana value of the discarded card. Interesting stuff. So this reminds me a lot of Razormane Masticore. This card was very similar, except it only dealt 3 damage. But you could discard a land, right? And then just dealt 3. With Argentum Masticore, you just discard like an expensive thing, and then you just get to trade that for an opposing thing that's in play. So it just makes it so your opponent doesn't really have incentive to play stuff too much, which I guess is a good thing. Pro multicolor is kind of cool, I guess. Mirren Safe House, 3 mana artifact. As long as on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of all land cards in all graveyards. So, if you have a Nykthos in the graveyard, it's a Nykthos. If you have a Wasteland in the graveyard, it's a Wasteland. There's probably some really broken shit you can do with this. If you have a land in the graveyard, it taps for mana. That's the big thing. Next up, Soulless Jailer. 2 mana 0/4, Phyrexian Golem. Permanent cards in graveyards can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. Very similar to like a Grafdigger's Cage on a guy. I'm not really sure if this is better than a Grafdigger's Cage, but it's certainly interesting. I'm sure some decks will want it as a sideboard thing. And then we get to the uncommons. They reprinted Prophetic Prism. That's kind of cool. They made some spell bombs that are all kind of bad. The lands are pretty sweet. Let's talk about these. So Mirrex, it's funny, they still have the thumb in this picture. So Mirrex is tap, add 1 land, or add a mana of any color. Activate only if Mirrex enter the battlefield this turn. Or tap, add a colorless. 3 tap, create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with toxic 1, and this creature can't block. Important to note, this can be done at instant speed, so you can play this like a draw go style land, like a Keldorn Outpost, and just use these to block. So this can technically just be a win condition all on its own. The turn you play it can tap for any color, so it kind of functions like a Tendo Ice Bridge in that regard. You might want to just like hold it as long as possible and just play it on the turn where you need a color of mana that's specific for removal or whatever. Yes, the creatures can't block, but you can still hold up counter spells, and then if your opponent doesn't do anything, you can activate it. Next up, the Monumental Facade. It's another sphere. It's important. There's a battlefield with 2 oil counters. Tap for a colorless. Tap, remove an oil counter from it, and put an oil counter on target artifact or creature you control, and activate only as a sorcery. There are 2 cards I want to do this to. Mind Splice Apparatus, to make things cost less mana. And I want to do it with Mercurial Spell Dancer, the 2/1 that wants oil counters to copy stuff. Those are the 2 cards that I got my eye on for the Monumental Facade. Now, Monumental Facade can also be snagged via Monumental Perfection, as can Mirrex. So if you want to play like a Mirrex control deck, you can play Monumental Perfection. And this can be done at instant speed as well. So you can just like hold up counter spells the whole game and then activate Monument, activate Mirrex, etc. Next up, the Seed Core, another sphere. Tap, add a colorless. Tap, add 1 mana of any color. Spend this mana only to cast Phyrexian creature spells. Considering most of the creatures in this set are Phyrexian, this is pretty good. Corrupted, tap. Target 1/1 creature gets +2/+1 till end of turn. Activate only if an opponent has 3 or more poison counters. So this is very similar to Pendlehaven. I wonder if this is Corrupted Pendlehaven. This might be Corrupted Pendlehaven. Next up, Mycosynth Gardens. Land Sphere. Tap, add a colorless. 1 tap, add a mana of any color. X tap. It becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. I don't know what else to say. This card's awesome. Copies your own artifacts. It's a land. It has a filter ability as well if you need it. It enters untapped. A lot to love about this land. There's no downsides. The only downside is it taps for a colorless instead of a colored mana. But I think you can use that very, very nicely. Copy Amulet of Vigor. Don't you put that evil on me. Then we have the fast land. This is a reprint cycle. Darkslick Shores, Seacrum Coast, Copperline Gorge, Blackleaf Cliffs, and Razorverge Thicket. These 5 lands are all going to be exceptional in Pioneer. Exceptional. There are going to be a lot of decks that build around them, and there are going to be a lot of decks that exist that incorporate them. This allied fast land cycle has been a wanted reprint for some time. I think both Razorverge Thicket and Copperline Gorge are going to be some of the better ones because they're green and they allow you to play Elf into a white or red 3-drop on turn 2. And then the Copperline Gorge also just is going to go in a lot of those elf decks that already exist. Blackleaf Cliffs is another one that's going to be seeing a lot of play. Most of the Rakdos decks are built with a very low curve, and Blackleaf Cliffs fits in them pretty naturally. It's important to note that it doesn't enter untapped for your 4th land drop for Shieldred. So it's important that you don't mess up there. But I still think you want to play some number in Rakdos mid. I really wish Chisgoria... let's talk about Chisgoria for a second. So, Chisgoria Forge Tyrant, 6 red. Legendary creature dragon. Affinity for artifacts. Costs 1 less for each artifact you control. Has flying and haste. It's a 5/4. When it attacks, exile the top 5 cards of your library. You may cast an artifact spell from among them this turn. If you do, it has affinity for artifacts. I've been playing Magic a long time. When the original Mirrodin came out, they had Scale of Chisgoria and Tooth of Chisgoria. They were artifacts that had affinity for artifacts, and they went in some of the affinity decks because they were just free things that had little abilities. They weren't that good. But I always wondered what Chisgoria was. I thought it was this ancient legendary dragon that had died long ago, and there were scales and teeth everywhere. I didn't know it was even alive until a week ago or whatever. And it kind of made me sad because this is a type of card that I think would be really cool for Pioneer. It'd be interesting, right? It'd be very, very sweet. And but it's just not legal. It's not even legal in Modern. It's just Commander only. And it's a real shame that they make a lot of cards that are Commander only, and we just don't get to play with if we don't play Commander. I'm not really a Commander guy, you know, and I would love to be able to play with this card. I think this card's really cool. Synthesis Pod's also pretty sweet. Another one that might be interesting to play with. It's like Spell Birthing Pod. You exile your spells while they're on the stack. Your opponent reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a card with mana value equal to 1 plus the exiled spell's mana value. Then you can play it. This card's really cool. The Jumpstart cards, I think, are all pretty medium. You got the Hex Gold Nabber. Goliath Hatchery is kind of cool. For 6 mana, you get 2 3/3s with Toxic 1. And then if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, you draw cards equal to its toxic value. You choose a creature you control, then draw cards equal to its toxic value. So, like, this one could be kind of cool. It's an enchantment, right? It sticks around. So you just draw an extra card every turn. But, yeah, that's it. Are there any cards I missed? Any cards you want to talk about that I haven't talked about yet? Let me know. That's going to do it for the MTG1 Phyrexia will be one set review for Pioneer. We went over all the rares and mythics, some of the uncommons, basically none of the commons. They only released the commons like the day before or whatever. and I honestly haven't looked at them all, but I've done a ton of work on the rares and mythics, and I'll be parsing the commons soon. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Have a good one.